West Germany, late 1970s. The air in the Orthodox émigré parish of St. Seraphim was cool, carrying the faint old scent of beeswax and incense. The small church was built of heavy, dark wood, designed to feel like a distant memory of the homeland. It was late on a Thursday evening, the hour reserved for those who could not attend the Sunday liturgy. Inside the confessional booth, the darkness was absolute, relieved only by the single faint lamp illuminating the carved wooden lattice separating the priest from the penitent. Dmitri, a man in his mid-50s who worked nights cleaning offices, knelt on the worn cushion. His voice was a low, rough whisper, struggling against an accumulation of fear and stress. He was not confessing a sin in the traditional sense. His burden was anxiety, a profound, crippling worry about his elder sister Sophia, who remained trapped in the Soviet Union. Sophia was a widow who had recently, and dangerously, applied for an exit visa for her young son, Dmitri's nephew. The boy was frail. The German doctors had offered a procedure that was unavailable back home. Dmitri's confession was a torrent of private desperation. He recounted how he had sent a small amount of cash through an unreliable, circuitous route. He confessed his irrational guilt over having left the country years ago, a guilt amplified by his current safety. Most specifically, he confessed to the agonizing choice he had just made: to contact an old family friend, a minor clerk in the German Interior Ministry, to ask about expediting a possible travel permit for his nephew, knowing this contact was politically risky for everyone involved. "I acted out of panic, Father," Dmitri whispered, his voice catching. "I risked everything for him. Tell me, is this an act of faith or simple selfish folly?" The priest, Father Alexei Morozov, offered the usual quiet counsel. He spoke of God's mercy and the burdens of family. He offered absolution for the sin of doubt and the folly of fear. The moment ended with the familiar, comforting ritual of forgiveness, leaving Dmitri feeling lighter, momentarily sheltered by the sacred silence of the enclosure. Within 5 days, the consequence landed, silently and efficiently, like dust settling on a forgotten desk. Dmitri arrived at the Interior Ministry for his follow-up appointment regarding his nephew's travel permit. The young official, whom Dmitri had successfully contacted just a week earlier, was now cold and unhelpful. The permit request was not merely denied, it was erased from the system, marked with a terse bureaucratic note about insufficient documentation regarding the sponsor's ongoing stability. Dmitri's current, entirely stable cleaning contract was suddenly flagged for an immediate, intrusive audit. 2 days later, Dmitri received a letter from his sister Sophia in Moscow. It was returned unopened, stamped with the simple, clear Soviet administrative marker, "Return to sender. Address unknown." The implication was chilling. Not that the address was wrong, but that the addressee had effectively ceased to exist as a public entity. Dmitri's contact in the German Interior Ministry, the friend he had confessed to approaching, also saw his promised job transfer to a better, more secure department cancelled without explanation. There was no political meeting, no public accusation. Instead, doors closed, opportunities dissolved, and communication lines snapped. The punishment precisely mirrored the private anxiety and risk Dmitri had confessed: loss of contact with Sophia, administrative scrutiny over his stability, and professional difficulty for his contact. Dmitri understood immediately. This was not coincidence. The priest, Father Alexei, understood something worse. The outcome matched the details of the confession exactly. Father Alexei Morozov sat alone in the small study behind the altar, the silence of the church heavy around him. He reviewed the week's schedule. He was a Soviet-ordained priest, his theological training steeped in the cautious, defensive tradition required to maintain a presence under sustained state pressure. He had endured the purges of the late 1950s and 60s, a survival that taught him the acute necessity of administrative flexibility. Now, he rotated through Western parishes on a tenuous, state-approved arrangement. His travel permissions were always fragile, tied directly to Moscow's assessment of his utility and, more importantly, his political silence. This arrangement was his life's architecture. His presence here meant a small, official outlet for the church still functioned. His absence would mean closure, a further excision of the church's reach. The true weight he carried was familial. His younger brother, Grigory, a railway engineer, still lived in the USSR, his status a permanent, unspoken point of leverage. Grigory was safe, for now, conducting his life within the established, narrow confines of the system. But Alexei knew that any administrative difficulty, any perceived political error on his part, could instantly transfer scrutiny from West Germany to a railway depot hundreds of kilometers away. Alexei saw himself as an administrator of continuity. He was tired, a deep, existential exhaustion born of decades spent navigating the difference between official truth and spiritual reality. He believed, with absolute conviction, that outright refusal to cooperate with the low-level procedural requests that periodically arrived from the consular office would only lead to a harsher, more difficult replacement. If he refused, they would simply install a new priest, one perhaps less invested in the pastoral care of the flock, one who might ask for a higher price. This belief was the cage he lived within. He sipped his cold tea, the lukewarm liquid doing little to warm the pit of anxiety in his stomach. The case of Dmitri was not the first such strange consequence. There had been others. The student whose scholarship application was suddenly stalled after he confessed to a crisis of faith that involved contemplating secular studies. The émigré tailor whose coveted transfer to a state workshop was cancelled after he confessed profound guilt over stealing supplies years earlier. In each instance, the administrative setback precisely mirrored the emotional content of the confession, avoiding any overt political or ideological charge. It was surgical, quiet, and targeted. Alexei reviewed his actions during Dmitri's confession. He had followed the ancient rules perfectly. The words were spoken in darkness, the questions were pastoral, and the seal of confession remained absolute. Yet, the outcome was undeniable. The state was not just listening, it was acting on the intimate, non-political weaknesses of his flock. His conflict was internal and cold. He needed to find the source of the leak. He needed to understand the mechanics so he could advise his parishioners on what, administratively, constituted an unacceptable risk. He did not see it as protecting his people from God's enemies, but as protecting his people from bureaucratic overreach. He was driven by a need for administrative survival, the quiet hope that silence and compliance would ensure the Church's continued, if diminished, presence abroad. He had no exit. To expose the mechanism would mean immediate exposure of his own arrangement, the destruction of his family's safety, and the end of the Church's presence. To remain silent was to enable harm. He chose, for the moment, the path of caution, of observation, the exhausting routine that was his true penance. The bell tower clock chimed the late hour, pulling him back to the paperwork on his desk. He picked up his pen and began drafting a rote procedural report on the maintenance status of the parish roof for the consulate. Survival demanded routine, even in the face of profound, chilling doubt. To grasp why the developments unfolding in the parish were so disturbing, it is necessary to understand the absolute silence built into the rite of confession. The Church, in any era, maintained its trust through its foundational, internal discipline. This discipline was centered entirely on the inviolable nature of the seal of confession. Canon law was absolute on this point. The act of sacramental confession was a direct, spiritual transaction between the penitent and God, witnessed by the priest. The priest served only as an instrument. The rule demanded complete secrecy. The mechanics of the sacrament were designed specifically to prevent any form of external recording or exploitation. No notes were taken during or after the confession. No records were permitted to be kept. The priest was strictly forbidden from even acknowledging, outside the confessional, that a specific individual had confessed to a specific burden or transgression. To violate the seal of confession was considered a grave offense, an act classified as a mortal sin carrying the penalty of automatic excommunication, a punishment more severe and absolute than any administrative sanction. The structural integrity of this silence made the confessional an exceptionally difficult target for any surveillance operation. Surveillance usually relies on observation, listening devices, hidden cameras, or physical interception of records. Confession, by its very nature, negated these methods. Spoken quietly in a darkened booth, the communication was transient and intentionally undocumented. It was, in effect, surveillance without observation, protected by an extreme penalty and centuries of tradition. The Church was trusted precisely because it was structurally silent. Its credibility was anchored in this enforced, mandatory forgetting. Parishioners like Dmitri placed their intimate fears and vulnerabilities within this ritual because they knew, implicitly, that the priest could not, by training or spiritual law, translate those fears into actionable data. Father Alexei had been taught this rule since his seminary days. It was the baseline of his priesthood. He had never once written a name, recorded a detail, or broken the silence. Yet, the pattern of consequences proved that something was translating emotional content into bureaucratic action. The very mechanism designed for spiritual safety was, somehow, being repurposed into a form of involuntary exposure. The baseline of trust was crumbling. An external system had found a way to utilize the ritual's output without demanding a direct violation of the seal itself. The slow, insidious change began with a small, seemingly administrative adjustment to Father Alexei's pastoral routine. For months, the process of confession had remained exactly as it should be. The same darkened booth, the familiar sequence of prayers, the same solemn absolution. Alexei adhered rigidly to the tradition of structural silence. He felt secure in the knowledge that his memory was the only medium of the confession, and memory, being fluid and flawed, was not something the state could reliably weaponize. Then, a new instruction arrived via the Soviet consular office, nestled deep within a thick packet of paperwork seemingly concerning the management of émigré church assets and pension liabilities. The instruction was framed as a need for clerical consistency across all international parishes. It introduced a mandatory standardized system for documenting the context surrounding pastoral duties. The official text claimed that by standardizing the documentation of external factors, like the consistency of attendance, the general emotional disposition of the flock, and the prevailing moral climate, Moscow could better allocate resources and understand the administrative needs of far-flung parishes. The change, as presented, was an administrative improvement. It was about consistency. Alexei was required to begin using a specific designated clerical aid. The object itself was entirely unremarkable. It was a small red ledger, bound in cheap, stiff synthetic leather, slightly smaller than his breviary. It had no identifying marks on the cover, save for a small embossed Cyrillic C for Sootvetvие, correspondence. Inside, the pages were lined and divided into precise, pre-printed columns with specific headers that looked like inventory tracking. This ledger was not to be used during confession, but immediately afterward, in the silence of his study, as part of the daily administrative closure. The instructions were explicit about what was not to be recorded. No names, no quoted sins, no specific details that could violate the seal. The focus was strictly on the generalized environment. Alexei convinced himself this was a tedious, bureaucratic demand, a relic of Moscow's obsessive need for measurable metrics. He saw it as a pointless exercise in documentation, but one he could not refuse without raising flags that would jeopardize his brother. He told himself that as long as he maintained the strict discipline of the seal, filling out the generalized forms in the ledger was a harmless compliance. And so, a sacred ritual that was founded on the principle of structural silence now, for the first time, consistently produced an artifact, the small red ledger waiting on his desk, ready to receive its daily generalized entry. A ritual of spiritual release now concluded with an act of low-level, required paperwork. The introduction of this physical object, plain, functional, and utterly devoid of drama, was the first visible anomaly in the Church's structural defense. The space that was once protected by memory and faith was now bridged by a small, red book. The implementation of the red ledger introduced a subtle but profound shift in the architecture of Father Alexei's listening. It moved the focus away from the specifics of moral failure and toward the standardization of emotional states. The instructions for the ledger demanded that Alexei summarize the burden of the confessions he heard each day. The focus was not on the content, but on the context. The columns in the red book were labeled with broad clinical categories. They required numerical notations based on perceived intensity and frequency rather than textual accounts. Alexei, determined to maintain the seal, meticulously avoided anything resembling a narrative. Instead, he forced the complex, chaotic reality of human suffering into the finite language of the state's requested metrics. The categories were insidious in their simplicity. Anticipatory grief, the expressed fear regarding a potential future loss, a pending travel refusal, an imminent health crisis facing a relative back east, or the collapse of a long-held promise of reunion. Guilt without action. This category indexed the expressions of profound regret over past decisions that had not yet resulted in specific illegal activity. For example, a man confessing to having thought about contacting a politically risky associate, but ultimately restraining himself. Fear without ideology. This was the most frequent category. It tracked anxiety rooted entirely in domestic, non-political matters, financial instability, marital stress, or the safety of family, but where the proximity of the Soviet state amplified the stress. The number here reflected the volume and intensity of generalized anxiety over personal status. The crucial enforced rule remained: no names, no quotes, no specific sins were to be written down. Alexei clung to this rule as his shield. He rationalized that by reducing the confession to these generalized numerical indices of feeling, he was abstracting the data to the point of administrative uselessness. He told himself, for example, that when Dmitry confessed his profound, anxious risk-taking regarding his nephew, Alexei was merely noting a high-intensity spike in the anticipatory grief column for the day and a corresponding tick in the guilt without action column. He did not write Dmitry, or travel permit, or interior ministry clerk. He merely recorded the emotional temperature of the flock. The process of translating a soul's intimate truth into a standardized entry began to feel disturbingly rote. He was required to produce an objective, generalized report on the collective emotional volatility of his parish. The cumulative effect was that confession, a ritual intended to cleanse and release, was now producing quantifiable, contextual data. The sacred exchange was being transformed into a generalized metric of risk. The information was depoliticized, yet it categorized the emotional leverage points of his parishioners. The confessional began to sound like a report. It was an extraction of context, a cataloging of the most sensitive anxieties that the state could, if it knew where to look, exploit. The physical object, the small red ledger, served as the bridge between the absolute silence of the spirit and the cold, procedural requirements of the administration. The system for indexing the flock's deepest, most vulnerable feelings was now fully formed. The chilling pattern established with Dmitry did not abate. It intensified, becoming a regular, undeniable fixture of life around the parish. The consequences arrived with such consistent precision that they ceased to feel like bureaucratic coincidence and became systemic retaliation. A young father, seeking counsel during a period of intense financial instability, confessed his overwhelming fear of being deported back to the Soviet sphere where his specialized trade was worthless. He confessed to considering an ill-advised, slightly criminal scheme to borrow money from a black market source. Within 2 weeks, his application for a critical work permit extension was denied, citing unstable financial background and potential for undesirable association. A widow confessed to Father Alexei her guilt over receiving, and not reporting, a small, undeclared annuity from a distant relative in the West, money she needed desperately but knew was technically illegal according to Soviet asset regulations. She focused on the moral weight of the deception. Soon after, her daughter, who was studying at a technical college in East Germany, found her student visa revoked for discrepancies in familial income reporting. Each consequence was subtle, yet ruinous. They were never arrests, never violence, never overt political moves. They were administrative shutdowns, visa denials, stalled paperwork, job interviews cancelled, letters returned, and sudden, intense scrutiny of personal finances. The targets were always the emotional vulnerability and the timing of the confession. Father Alexei began recording these outcomes in a separate, secret section of his journal, numbering the cases. The correlation was mathematically stark. 8 distinct instances over 4 months where the bureaucratic consequence precisely matched the specific, non-political, emotional vulnerability confessed in the privacy of the booth. The priest's realization hardened into agonizing certainty. This was no longer coincidence. The red ledger, The numerical indexing of guilt and grief was not harmless administration. It was a functioning censor, and the system was utilizing the emotional context he supplied to apply targeted pressure. The stakes increased exponentially. He was now a silent accomplice to the systematic compromise of his own flock. He was the one cataloguing the very anxiety that the state then amplified. Yet, he felt caged by the knowledge. He could not stop the practice of filling the ledger without exposing his non-compliance to the administrative system in Moscow, triggering the exact punitive mechanisms he feared: the immediate removal of his clerical post and, worse, the transfer of scrutiny to his brother Grigory. To continue, however, meant enabling the slow strangulation of his parishioners' hopes and security. He was caught in a lethal stasis, forced to continue documenting the evidence of his own collaboration, unable to find the single piece of irrefutable proof that would explain the mechanism without exposing the man. The consequences piled up quietly around him, each one a testament to the system's ability to weaponize inner turmoil. He was listening to secrets only to see them materialize as devastating paperwork days later. Father Alexei had convinced himself that his numerical indexing, the careful placement of emotional burdens into generalized categories like anticipatory grief or guilt without action, was sufficient to protect the seal of confession. He was dealing in abstract anxiety, not specific facts. The system, however, was designed to find patterns in the abstract. The critical error occurred subsequently, in the language the system used to justify its administrative action. One of his flock, a retired professor, had come to him confessing a profound sense of abandonment by historical forces. The professor was speaking of personal failure, the sense that the great causes he had dedicated his youth to had dissolved, leaving him isolated and purposeless in the West. He spoke of his inability to reconcile his past service with his current reality. In his counseling, Alexei had used a specific, carefully chosen pastoral phrase, a nuanced theological concept of spiritual exile. We must accept that the icon is hidden, not destroyed. He used this phrase to encourage the professor to see his current isolation as a temporary state, a trial of faith rather than total collapse. A few weeks later, the professor was called in for a routine check-in regarding his residency status, a meeting that should have been a formality. The conversation, however, quickly turned clinical and invasive. The immigration interviewer, a German bureaucrat with no known political connection, asked the professor a seemingly innocuous yet profoundly penetrating question about his future plans. The professor later recounted the exchange to Alexei, still shaken. The interviewer asked him if he truly believed his commitment to his adopted nation was permanent, or if he felt his past political loyalties were merely hidden, not destroyed. The effect on Alexei was immediate and paralyzing. The wording was identical, not a similar sentiment, but the same structured phrase, carrying the same specific, contextual weight of spiritual political ambiguity. A phrase crafted in the absolute silence of the confessional, used to soothe a profound personal crisis, had somehow migrated into a bureaucratic interrogation. Alexei reviewed the red ledger entry for that day. Under the professor's general category, a high mark in guilt without action, coupled with anticipatory grief, he had also added a small, handwritten note to himself in the margins. Focus on the hidden icon concept. He used this notation to ensure consistency in his spiritual guidance, a reference point for follow-up. The proof was damning. Human speech, especially human grief, is chaotic, expansive, and unique. Bureaucratic language, however, is finite and tends toward repetition. The appearance of a specific pastoral concept in an official context suggested that the administrative system was not just receiving data, it was receiving processed and categorized language generated by the priest. The profound recognition of that phrase was the moment the system's camouflage failed. Intelligence reports should not sound pastoral. They should not reflect the precise, esoteric language of a priest trying to reconcile a soul. The language leakage confirmed that Alexei's own organizational structure, his little red book used for self-reference, was the source of the state's unnerving vocabulary. His tool for administrative consistency had become the means of his exposure. The discovery of the leakage began in a sterile, windowless office belonging to a Western counterintelligence analyst in Frankfurt, a team focused on the movement of people and the subtle evolution of hostile language. They were not watching Father Alexei. They were watching the system he was connected to. The analysts were operating with a few key credibility anchors gleaned from defector testimony and historical data, such as the initial disclosures from the Mitrokhin archive. They knew the KGB had a long-established pattern of infiltrating religious organizations abroad, often utilizing clergy under codenames like Mikhailov or Drozdov for passive influence and information gathering. They knew that church influence abroad was a priority. Their focus was entirely on language and timing correlations. The intelligence feed they processed was immense, a constant stream of low-level reports, consular travel manifests, visa denial justifications, police report language, and routine Western intelligence debriefings of émigrés. None of this data, viewed in isolation, pointed to the St. Seraphim parish. The team utilized a sophisticated cross-referencing system. They ran algorithms designed to flag repeated phrases that were structurally abnormal for bureaucratic communication. Their logic was that the state always defaults to sterile, repetitive terminology. Any sudden appearance of nuanced, emotionally charged, or quasi-theological language in multiple disparate administrative files indicated a non-standard information source. The system began flagging phrases associated with the consequences suffered by Alexei's parishioners. Potential for undesirable association, insufficient documentation regarding the sponsor's ongoing stability, and discrepancies in familial income reporting. These phrases were common enough, but the algorithm noticed their statistically improbable clustering and timing. The critical spike occurred when the system flagged the phrase, "The icon is hidden, not destroyed," appearing in an unexpected administrative context, the professor's residency interview file. The analyst realized this phrase was too specific, too evocative for a simple visa clerk to invent. The team then cross-referenced the precise dates these specific consequences occurred against the travel schedules of Soviet-affiliated personnel. The pattern became visible. The administrative actions often fell within a 7 to 14-day window following Father Alexei's return to the West from his regular mandatory reporting trips to the Soviet consulate, or immediately after a courier run from the consulate back to Moscow. Finally, they linked the location. All affected individuals were associated with a single small institution, St. Seraphim Orthodox parish. The analysts didn't need the red book. They didn't need to violate the seal of confession. The system revealed itself through its own output consistency. Their hypothesis solidified. A Soviet-influenced information gathering system was operating within the parish. It was not recording names, which would constitute a direct violation of the seal and risk exposure, but it was systematically recording high-quality contextual leverage points, the emotional pressure release valves of the community. This data was then being fed into the administrative stream, allowing the state to apply targeted, plausible sanctions that appeared entirely bureaucratic. The phrase, "The icon is hidden, not destroyed," was the key piece of language leakage, proof that a subjective pastoral concept had been translated into a generalized bureaucratic assessment of loyalty. This pattern interrupt was the definitive proof that the priest's internal administrative system was the source of the data. The Western analysis focused on the geometry of the flow. The information was high quality, non-political, focused on vulnerability, and consistently timed to the priest's official movements. The operational conclusion was clear. The system was not watching the church was watching itself, and the state was reading the notes. The full, devastating reality of the system settled upon Father Alexei with cold certainty. The state's bureaucracy was built entirely upon his professional diligence. The red ledger, the small, seemingly harmless administrative aid, was an emotional indexing system. Alexei retrieved the small book from its lockbox in the study. He ran his fingers over the stiff, synthetic cover, seeing it now as a weapon. He turned to the pages, reviewing the columns he had so scrupulously filled. Anticipatory grief, guilt without action, fear without ideology. He had spent months justifying his actions. He never broke the seal. He never named names. He never wrote down a quoted sin or a criminal detail. He had told himself that by abstracting the information, by reducing profound personal crises to mere numerical spikes on a standardized chart, he was rendering the data harmless, adhering to the letter of the law while protecting his flock. He believed this was the price of administrative survival. The reality was crushing. The system did not need the specific details of the confession. It needed the contextual leverage. The KGB had been running a long-term psychological and administrative infiltration, leveraging the very foundation of spiritual trust. By requiring Alexei to standardize and quantify the feelings surrounding the confessions, they were acquiring perfect data points on the vulnerabilities of the émigré community. They knew who was anxious about a family member's health, who was contemplating risky financial schemes, and who felt alienated enough to question their past loyalties. The phrase was the key to understanding the mechanism. His private note about that specific pastoral concept, meant only to guide his counseling, became a data point that confirmed the presence of a unique and focused psychological burden, a man grappling with political disillusionment disguised as spiritual exile. When that phrase appeared in a subsequent security file, it proved that the system could translate his abstract notation back into actionable, personalized intelligence. Alexei had indeed kept the promise of the seal. He had preserved the content of the confession. But in his effort to provide the requested administrative consistency, he had weaponized the context. He had codified the emotional geometry of his flock, creating a reliable, consistent report on who was most susceptible to pressure and what kind of pressure would be most effective. Visa denial for the financially insecure, family scrutiny for the homesick, and existential questioning for the disillusioned. The Red Book was the central processing unit of a silent surveillance network. It was the physical manifestation of the system's betrayal. The icon was revealed as a bureaucratic artifact, a ledger that proved standardization always leaves a traceable, exploitable pattern. He did not betray faith. The system simply betrayed itself by requiring him to build a perfect, quantifiable blueprint of emotional vulnerability. The Western counterintelligence report, once finalized, was not leaked to the press or used to score a dramatic diplomatic victory. Instead, the analysts, recognizing the sensitivity and the unique structural nature of the mechanism, chose a path of deliberate, quiet disruption. The goal was systemic dismantling. They began subtly manipulating the administrative context around Father Alexei. Travel permits that Moscow routinely granted for visiting foreign clergy suddenly met with unforeseen scheduling conflicts on the German side. Communication channels between the consulate and the parish, once seamless, began experiencing inexplicable, low-level interruptions, forms misplaced, requests delayed, calls rerouted. The pressure was not applied directly to Alexei, but to the seamless flow of the data system he was feeding. Moscow's administrative center, obsessed with consistency, immediately noticed the sudden, unexplained drop in efficiency and the instability of their agents' access. The high-quality emotional indices that Father Alexei routinely submitted via the Red Ledger began arriving late or were corrupted by long, unpredictable delays. The data's value was predicated on its timeliness, and the Western counterpressure degraded the system's primary asset, speed. The response from the Soviet administrative wing was swift and entirely bureaucratic. They did not launch an investigation into a compromised priest. They launched a review of an inefficient protocol. The logic was simple. The system was no longer functioning with the required administrative precision. Within weeks, the official orders arrived via diplomatic pouch. Father Alexei was to be immediately reassigned to a remote internal post in the Soviet Far East, a region known for its lack of foreign contacts and administrative complexity. His rotation through the Western parishes was deemed administratively complete. No charges were filed, and no reasons were given beyond the need for reallocation of resources. The red ledgers, used across several compromised parishes, were recalled and summarily destroyed, incinerated as obsolete bureaucratic inventory. The system had been exposed by a paper trail that had become statistically inefficient. The few priests involved were quietly reassigned, their careers redirected to administrative dead ends. The network, which had been so invasive and so effective at weaponizing the very silence of the confessional, ended in a flurry of finalized paperwork, stale travel manifests, and the quiet dissolution of an administrative protocol. The most invasive surveillance network ever constructed within the church ended in a quiet, non-specific order for reassignment and the shredding of outdated forms. The fall of the church network, known internally in the West as the hidden icon operation, remains a chilling case study in the power of administrative consistency. It transcended the simple narrative of a double agent or a technological breach. The icon was never truly holy or evil. It was simply bureaucratic. It was the concept of standardized information itself, the belief that human complexity could be neatly packaged into metrics. This standardization created the traceable signature that allowed the network to be reversed and neutralized. Father Alexei, the man at the center, was not a monster of betrayal, nor was he a hero of resistance. He was a victim of his own, long-cultivated survival mechanism, the exhausting, decades-long commitment to administrative compliance. His failure was not a breakdown of faith, but a flaw in his professional calculus. He believed that if he meticulously complied with the bureaucratic requests, however intrusive, he could guarantee the safety of his family and the continued tenuous existence of his church. His core mistake was quantitative. He assumed that by protecting the specific content of the confession, names, dates, crimes, he was protecting the individual. He failed to recognize that in a modern state, the quantified emotional context is often the more powerful and reliable weapon. The final insight into the hidden icon operation is a testament to the inescapable truth of bureaucracy. Standardization always leaves a trace. The network was exposed by Western analysts, noticing that the consequences in their administrative files were too consistent, too precise, and too emotionally informed to be random. The emotional indexing system was too perfect. Its language was too clean. Father Alexei did not betray his faith. He believed he was protecting it through procedural obedience. The system, in its relentless demand for administrative consistency, ultimately betrayed itself. It created an archive of vulnerability that was so meticulously organized, so beautifully patterned, that it became its own legible blueprint for infiltration and subsequent collapse.